The narrative begins with a world in turmoil, and England and France locked in a protracted conflict that stretched across generations and landscapes, shaping the destinies of countless people. More than half a century had passed since the opening volleys of the 100 Years' War, a struggle not only for territorial control, but for legitimacy, pride, and the right to claim sovereignty over the French crown. By the early 15th century, the conflict had become a saga of intermittent truce and renewed violence. It was against this backdrop that young King Henry V emerged, a man who, despite inheriting a fractured kingdom and the baggage of his father's usurpation, was determined to assert his authority both at home and abroad. For many Englishmen, the war in France represented an opportunity to restore lands and titles that had been lost or to gain new wealth in a foreign realm. For Henry, it was a chance to solidify his legitimacy and to fulfill what he believed was a divinely sanctioned destiny. His quest would culminate at a muddy field near the small French village of Agincourt in 1415, where an unlikely English army of archers and men-at-arms would stand against a much larger French host. The story of Agincourt is one of preparation and perseverance, where the seeds of victory were sown long before the first arrows flew, long before Henry set foot on French soil. The societal fabric of England had woven the skills and manpower necessary for his campaign. The longbow, a simple yet devastating weapon, had become the hallmark of English martial prowess. It was not invented at Agincourt. Rather, it evolved from centuries of archery tradition rooted in the forests and villages of Wales and England. Young boys were required by law to practice archery, their arms and backs strengthened by years of drawing yew bows with draw weights so heavy that the bones of archers were often bent from the strain. Archaeological finds and preserved bows, such as those from the Tudor warship Mary Rose, reveal that these bows required draw weights exceeding 100 pounds. Contemporary commentators marveled at the piercing power of the weapon, noting how arrows could penetrate armor at close range and create a storm so thick that it darkened the sky. Training from childhood meant that by the time of the 100 Years' War, England possessed a pool of skilled archers unparalleled in Europe. Though the nobility often dominated medieval warfare, in the hands of common yeomen, the longbow shifted the balance of power, making peasant archers a decisive force on the battlefield. Henry's rise to power in 1413 was fraught with challenges. The young king had to consolidate his rule amid domestic unrest and rebellious nobles. He sought unity through religious suppression of Lollards and by reconciling rival factions. Yet his ambition lay across the Channel. England had long laid claim to French territories through the rights of the Plantagenets, and Henry believed he had a legitimate claim to the French throne itself. Diplomatic negotiations with the French Valois court were fraught. When demands for the return of Normandy and the hand of Princess Catherine met with mockery, Henry decided war was inevitable. He assembled an army that included around 6,000 to 10,000 men, many of them longbowmen, along with men-at-arms, including knights and squires. Chroniclers emphasize how this army, though relatively small compared to French muster, was disciplined and motivated. They were professional soldiers and retinues bound by contracts with the crown, not feudal levies who might melt away once the campaigning season ended. Henry financed his campaign through loans from merchants and the support of Parliament, which saw war as a means to enrich the realm and to reinforce national identity. In August 1415, Henry launched his invasion, landing at the mouth of the Seine with an army that expected a swift siege followed by negotiation. The first objective was the fortress town of Harfleur, an important port whose capture would provide a base for further operations. The siege lasted longer than planned. 5 weeks of disease, artillery bombardment, and stubborn resistance. Dysentery, or the bloody flux, swept through the English camp, felling hundreds and sapping the strength of the army. By the time Harfleur capitulated, many archers and soldiers were dead or too ill to continue. Historians estimate that the English lost perhaps 2,000 men at Harfleur, a substantial portion of the original force, leaving Henry with roughly 6,000 to march across France. The loss of men and the onset of autumn posed severe challenges. However, Henry decided to demonstrate resolve and to strike fear into the French by marching his army from Harfleur to the English-held port of Calais. He knew that a successful march would boost morale, show that the English army remained unbroken, and perhaps force the French to open negotiations. The march to Calais was arduous. The English trudged northward through hostile territory, crossing the Somme while being shadowed by larger French forces under the Constable Charles d'Albret and prominent nobles like the Dukes of Orléans, Bourbon, and Brabant. The French sought to intercept and destroy Henry's army before it could reach safety. They believed their superior numbers, estimated between 20,000 and 30,000 men, would overwhelm the English. Many French knights looked forward to capturing Henry and his men, expecting a profitable harvest of ransoms. On the English side, tension mounted as provisions dwindled and the weather turned foul. Rain drenched the troops, turning fields to mud and exacerbating disease. Soldiers' shoes rotted away and rations shrank. Henry maintained strict discipline, forbidding his men to break ranks to forage or to pillage villages, actions that might invite French attack and undermine his moral standing. When French heralds demanded that Henry name a time and place to give battle, he refused, choosing to march on his terms. His scouts eventually found a ford across the Somme, enabling the army to evade French traps and continue north. On the evening of 24th October 1415, Henry's weary army reached a narrow field bordered by dense woods near the villages of Maisoncelles and Tramicourt, close to the small village of Agincourt. There he met the French army arrayed to block his path. The ground between the armies was roughly 700 to 1,000 yards across, recently ploughed and soaked by days of rain. The terrain was hemmed in by woods on either side, creating a funnel that limited maneuver and forced any advance through a narrow corridor. Henry recognized the advantages this offered. The French cavalry would be unable to outflank his position, and the mud would hamper heavy horses and armor. He ordered his men to camp and prepare for battle the next day. The English army was likely around 6,000 strong, of which perhaps 5,000 were longbowmen and 1,000 men-at-arms. Henry placed his men into 3 battles or divisions. On either wing, he positioned longbowmen behind a line of sharpened stakes, angled to deter cavalry charges. The stakes, a technique first used by Welsh archers and improved by Henry, were driven into the ground at a waist height. Between the divisions he stationed his men-at-arms, dismounted knights and squires clad in plate armor who would fight on foot to hold the line. Henry himself took a place in the center with his household knights, the royal banner flying overhead. Across the field, the French assembled a formidable force. Their numbers are debated, with some chronicles suggesting tens of thousands and others positing a more conservative figure around 12,000 to 20,000. Regardless, the French significantly outnumbered the English. The French host comprised 3 lines of men-at-arms, both mounted and dismounted, supported by crossbowmen and a smaller contingent of archers. At the front, the vanguard comprised the nobility, determined to prove their honor and to capture valuable prisoners. Behind them, 2 more lines of men-at-arms and a reserve awaited orders. French commanders had quarreled about tactics. Some advocated an immediate full-scale assault with cavalry to break the English archers, while others counseled caution and allowed missile troops to skirmish first. However, the rigid code of chivalry pushed many knights to demand personal glory in close combat. The French battle plan ultimately called for mounted knights to lead the charge and disordered coordination between crossbowmen and men-at-arms. Their armor was of high quality but heavy, weighing down the knights as they prepared to advance through thick mud. The French expected an easy victory over an exhausted enemy. Some nobles had brought extra rope to tie up prisoners for ransom. The morning of 25 October, the feast day of Saints Crispin and Crispinian, dawned damp and foggy. English soldiers attended Mass, sought absolution, and made peace with God. Chroniclers describe Henry moving among his troops, speaking words of encouragement. While the famous speech in Shakespeare's Henry V is a dramatization, it draws upon the real sense of camaraderie and shared destiny that Henry cultivated. He reminded his soldiers that they were fighting for their king, their God, and their homeland. Contemporary accounts note that Henry wore a crown over his helmet, making himself visible to inspire his men and to show he shared their peril. He promised rewards and loyalty, forging what later generations would call a band of brothers, an egalitarian fraternity bound by common cause rather than rank. For hours, the 2 armies faced each other in the muddy field, each waiting for the other to make the first move. The English were too outnumbered to attack, and the French were reluctant to advance across the treacherous ground under a hail of arrows. Eventually, Henry ordered his men to close the distance, moving stakes forward to within bowshot of the French. This bold repositioning forced the French to react. According to chroniclers, Henry's line advanced while blowing horns, drums, and shouting war cries of St. George. As they halted and reset their stakes, English archers planted themselves and prepared to unleash a barrage. Henry's move enraged the French, who interpreted it as an affront to their honor. French commanders commanded their lines forward. The first French action was a charge by armored knights on horseback. They spurred their destriers through the quagmire, their hooves sinking deep into the mud. As the charge gathered momentum, the English archers raised their bows and loosed arrows in rapid volleys. The longbow had an effective range of over 200 yards, and trained archers could shoot 10 to 12 arrows per minute. Thousands of arrows filled the air, described by witnesses as a darkening cloud. The arrows found their mark, killing horses, piercing mail and leather, and wounding unarmored parts of the knights' bodies. Horses reared, stumbled, and threw their riders. Others collapsed in the mud. The few who reached the English lines were met by stakes that impaled horses or forced them to veer off. Disrupted and shocked, the cavalry fell back in disarray, some colliding with the next line of French men-at-arms advancing on foot. The second wave consisted of thousands of dismounted French knights and men-at-arms trudging forward in heavy armor. They advanced in deep ranks, shoulder to shoulder, weighed down by breastplates, helmets, greaves, and weapons. The wet, churned earth sucked at their feet, causing them to slip and become tangled. As they pressed forward, English arrows continued to rain down, hitting faces, limbs, and joints in armor. Those struck fell, only to be trampled by comrades behind them. The crush became so great that men could barely raise their arms to strike. Some suffocated under the press of bodies. Yet still they struggled on, driven by a combination of courage and the inability to retreat. When they reached the English line, they were exhausted and disordered. English men-at-arms stepped forward from between the stakes, wielding swords, axes, maces, and mallets. Archers dropped their bows, drew sidearms like hatchets and long knives, and joined the melee, attacking the French flanks and backs. Fighting at close quarters was brutal and suffocating. The muddy ground made footing precarious, causing many to slip and fall. Once down, a knight encumbered by armor had great difficulty rising. Archers swarmed over them, cutting throats or prying visors open with daggers. Reports of the battle emphasize how the longbow's effect was not simply in killing, but in breaking the formation and morale of the French. English arrows often lodged in armor, causing pain and shock rather than death. But the psychological impact was immense. The French found their bravery undermined by the hail of missiles they could not effectively counter. Their own crossbowmen and archers, posted far behind the lines, could not match the range or rate of fire. Some chroniclers suggest that the French failed to bring forward their crossbowmen early enough, while others claim that French archers' arrows were deflected by the heavier rain of English shafts. Additionally, the narrow field prevented French forces from deploying fully. Only the front ranks could engage, leaving many men idle and frustrated. The reserve forces were hemmed in by their own vanguard and by the woods. The chaos intensified as the French second line, consisting of more men-at-arms and nobles, attempted to advance. They encountered the remnants of the first wave retreating or struggling, resulting in collisions and confusion. Many high-ranking nobles, such as the Dukes of Brabant and Alençon, fought valiantly. Some reached Henry's personal guard and nearly broke through. According to some sources, the Duke of Alençon struck Henry's crown, knocking off a piece of it. Henry's brother Humphrey, Duke of Gloucester, was injured and nearly captured before Henry and his guard rescued him. The intensity of the fight at the center demonstrates that despite the overall collapse of the French assault, pockets of fierce resistance existed. Nonetheless, the cumulative effect of fatigue, mud, and relentless English blows caused the French to falter. As the French vanguard was slaughtered, another crisis loomed. A group of French soldiers, including some peasants, circled around through the woods and attacked the English camp at Maisoncelles, where wagons, baggage, and non-combatants were located. They hoped to rescue captives or create a diversion. When Henry learned of this raid, he feared that a renewed French assault might strike his exhausted troops from behind. He faced the problem of what to do with the hundreds of French prisoners taken during the melee. Convention dictated that nobles captured in battle were ransomed rather than killed, but Henry worried that prisoners might seize weapons and renew the fight. After conferring with his council, he ordered that most prisoners be put to death. This decision shocked even some of his own captains, who initially refused to obey until Henry threatened punishment. As a result, several hundred prisoners, mainly those of lower rank, were killed. Henry spared the most valuable nobles, whose ransoms would enrich his coffers. Modern historians debate whether this order constituted a war crime or a harsh but necessary decision in the chaos of battle. The raid on the baggage was eventually repelled, and the remaining French reserves melted away. leaving the field under English control. By afternoon, the battle was over. French casualties were catastrophic. Estimates vary, but many suggest that between 7,000 and 10,000 French soldiers died, including a significant portion of their nobility. Leading nobles such as the Constable Charles d'Albret, the Duke of Alençon, the Duke of Brabant, the Duke of Bar, and numerous counts and barons perished. The French prisoner list included the Duke of Orléans and the Count of Vendôme. English losses were comparatively light. Contemporary reports cite figures ranging from fewer than 100 to a few hundred. Among the slain were notable men like Sir Edward of Norwich, 2nd Duke of York, and Michael de la Pole, 3rd Earl of Suffolk. The disproportionate casualties underscored the effectiveness of the English tactics and the longbow. The battle lasted perhaps 3 hours, though some chroniclers compress it to a shorter span. In the immediate aftermath, Henry gathered his commanders and offered prayers of thanksgiving. He ordered the battlefield cleared and the dead buried. He also ensured that his men treated the fallen nobility with respect, sending the bodies of prominent French lords back to their families when possible. Henry's army remained on the field for a day to confirm that the French would not counterattack, and then resumed the march to Calais. The victorious army arrived at Calais on 29th October, where they were greeted as heroes. Chroniclers recorded the triumphal entry into London weeks later, with Henry riding in a procession, accompanied by French prisoners and carrying the captured French banners. Londoners celebrated with feasts and pageants, and Parliament quickly voted new taxes and supplies for the king. The victory at Agincourt solidified Henry's reputation as a divinely favoured warrior king and bolstered support for continued campaigns in France. The victory had far-reaching consequences beyond immediate glory. In France, the defeat exacerbated divisions among factions supporting the Armagnac and Burgundian parties. The death toll severely weakened the French nobility, removing experienced commanders and destabilizing the political landscape. King Charles VI of France, who suffered from bouts of mental illness, was unable to lead effectively. This vacuum opened the door for Henry to negotiate from a position of strength. By 1420, Henry concluded the Treaty of Troyes with the Burgundians and Queen Isabeau of France, recognizing him as the heir and regent of France and promising his marriage to Charles VI's daughter, Catherine of Valois. Although the treaty was contested by the Dauphin Charles, later Charles VII, it represented a high watermark for English ambitions on the continent. For England, Agincourt became an enduring symbol of national pride and divine favor. Chroniclers and poets portrayed Henry as the perfect Christian king, guided by providence and leading a righteous cause. The battle reinforced the image of the longbowman as the backbone of English military power. The idea that common archers could defeat armored nobility resonated deeply, suggesting a form of social leveling that challenged traditional hierarchies. Parliament, filled with men who had fought at Agincourt or knew those who had, basked in the reflected glory. Debates about raising funds for war were colored by references to the heroism of the Band of Brothers, a term popularized centuries later by Shakespeare, but rooted in the camaraderie of the campaign. Despite the triumph, Agincourt did not end the war. Henry continued campaigns in France, capturing towns and fortresses, and pressing his claim as heir to the French throne. His marriage to Catherine of Valois in 1420 produced a son, the future Henry VI. However, Henry's death in 1422, at the age of 35, cut short his ambitions. His infant son inherited both the English crown and the nominal kingship of France, plunging both countries into new conflicts and civil wars. The eventual revival of French fortunes under Joan of Arc and King Charles VII would reverse English gains and render the Treaty of Troyes void. Nevertheless, Agincourt remained a reference point for English military identity. As the centuries passed, the story of Agincourt evolved. Chroniclers such as Jean de Wavrin, Enguerrand de Monstrelet, and Thomas Elman provided contemporary accounts of the battle. Later, historians like Edward Hall and Raphael Holinshed incorporated the tale into chronicles that would inspire William Shakespeare. In his play Henry V, Shakespeare dramatized the battle with stirring speeches and heroic imagery, presenting the king as a charismatic leader who forged a band of brothers with his men. The St. Crispin's Day speech is a fictionalized invention, but it captures the egalitarian spirit that many believed characterized Henry's leadership. In the speech, Henry proclaims that those who fight with him will be remembered, and that gentle and common men will become noble through their deeds. The phrase, "we few, we happy few, we band of brothers," has endured in English-speaking cultures as a symbol of unity in adversity. While there is no record of Henry uttering such words, the speech resonates because it reflects a deeper truth, that in the mud and blood of Agincourt, social distinctions mattered less than courage and shared experience. Modern historians have re-examined Agincourt through various lenses, challenging myths and offering nuanced interpretations. Some have questioned the numbers traditionally cited, suggesting that the French army may not have been as large as once thought, and that the English may have numbered closer to 6,000 than 9,000. Archaeological studies of the battlefield and analyses of casualty records provide better estimates of the French dead, often suggesting around 7,000 to 8,000 fatalities. The role of the longbow has been scrutinized, with scholars noting that while it was decisive, other factors contributed: terrain, weather, French disorganization and overconfidence, and Henry's leadership. Additionally, the decision to execute prisoners has been debated in terms of legality and morality. Some argue that Henry violated chivalric norms. Others maintain he acted pragmatically to secure victory and protect his men. The legacy of Agincourt extends beyond military history. It speaks to themes of leadership, the relationship between king and subjects, and the power of technology to disrupt social order. The longbow, though a simple weapon, required a lifetime of practice and physical strength. This practice was codified in English law. Archery was not merely encouraged but mandated, with Sunday sessions replacing frivolous games. Communities took pride in their archers, and tournaments offered prizes. The men who drew the great bows developed distinctive physiques, with strong backs and shoulders. Their skeletons show stress marks where muscles attached to bone. They were not serfs, but free men, many of them small farmers or artisans. By giving them a prominent role in battle, Henry and his predecessors elevated a class of men whose loyalty could be cultivated through fair treatment and respect. The bands of brothers concept thus reflects a social contract. The king would fight alongside his archers, acknowledging their contribution. In return, the archers would fight fiercely for the king. Equally important is the cultural memory of the battle. During the 16th and 17th centuries, Agincourt was invoked by English monarchs seeking to justify wars against France or to galvanize national unity. Elizabeth of Mearn's speeches often reference Henry V's example, urging subjects to emulate his courage. During World War II, Winston Churchill evoked Shakespeare's portrayal of the battle to inspire Britain's resisting Nazi Germany. The idea of a small, beleaguered island nation standing against a continental power remained potent. The longbowmen, though replaced by modern soldiers, symbolized the resilience and ingenuity of ordinary people defending their home. Beyond the realm of myth, the practical lessons of Agincourt influenced military thinking. Commanders across Europe noted the importance of positioning, terrain, and discipline. The French learned to respect missile troops and to reconsider frontal assaults in narrow spaces. Some French chroniclers blamed the defeat on hubris and disunity among the nobility. Others recognized that without reforms, French armies would continue to suffer. In subsequent years, the French adapted by employing larger numbers of handgunners and field artillery, technologies that would ultimately outclass the longbow. Yet for a time, the memory of Agincourt served as a cautionary tale. While it is tempting to view Agincourt solely through the lens of national narratives, the battle also reveals the interconnectedness of Europe. Many soldiers in Henry's army were not English but Welsh, Scottish, Irish, and even continental mercenaries. Welsh archers, in particular, had honed their skills in the rugged hills of their homeland and had fought alongside English kings since the 13th century. Their contributions at Agincourt were significant. Some sources note that there were around 500 Welsh archers among Henry's force. Their pay was higher than that of a ploughman, making military service an attractive option. The French army likewise included knights and men-at-arms from across France and its vassal states. The battle thus represented not only a clash between nations, but a confluence of regional identities and loyalties. In telling the complete story of Agincourt, it is crucial to differentiate between verified facts and later embellishments. Verified facts come from contemporary accounts, official records, and analysis grounded in archaeology and scholarship. We know, for instance, that Henry's army was smaller than the French, that the terrain was muddy, that longbowmen were decisive, and that French casualties were heavy. Sources like the World History Encyclopedia provide careful estimates of troop numbers and casualty figures, noting that the English might have had around 6,000 men, while the French fielded between 12,000 and 36,000. Other sources, such as English Monarchs and BritishBattles.com, present inflated numbers, suggesting that the French army numbered up to 60,000 or even 100,000, a claim most historians view as speculative. Similarly, stories about the French cutting off the middle fingers of captured archers to prevent them from drawing bows, while popular, lack strong contemporary evidence. These tales likely arose later and were embellished to highlight the brutality of the conflict. Another area where speculation creeps in involves the draw weight and capabilities of the longbow. The Guardian and other sources note that draw weights of surviving longbows can exceed 140 pounds. However, the exact draw weight of bows used at Agincourt is uncertain. Experiments with replica bows suggest that skilled archers could draw between 80 and 120 pounds regularly, with higher weights possible but more demanding. Likewise, the assertion that archers could fire 15 arrows per minute should be treated as an upper limit. Sustained rates would have been lower, especially during prolonged engagements. Nonetheless, the psychological effect of thousands of arrows is indisputable. When considering the casualties, modern scholarship tends to adopt a moderate view. It is verified that the French lost thousands of men, including many nobles, while the English lost relatively few. The US Army Tradoc article, a modern military analysis, suggests English casualties between 100 and 500 and French casualties between 7,000 and 10,000 or. These figures align with many academic estimates. In contrast, some popular histories inflate English casualties to 1,500 or more, and French to 10,000 or 12,000 without clear evidence. Such numbers often serve to amplify the perceived heroism of the English. An aspect that deserves attention is the logistical and administrative apparatus behind the English campaign. Henry's ability to assemble and sustain an army for months in hostile territory required meticulous planning. Contracts called indentures bound lords and knights to serve with specific numbers of men-at-arms and archers, ensuring that the king knew precisely how many soldiers he could rely on. Pay rates were clearly defined. An archer might earn sixpence per day, a sum that attracted many to service. Henry also arranged for ships, artillery, and engineers to accompany the invasion. The role of the king's supply officers, called purveyors, cannot be underestimated. They seized or purchased food and equipment along the route, sometimes causing friction with local populations. The financial burdens were borne partly by Parliament, which levied taxes with surprising willingness, given the potential rewards. The social dimension of Agincourt emerges vividly when examining how veterans were honoured and integrated into the political fabric of England. The History of Parliament booklet on the Band of Brothers highlights how parliamentarians celebrated the victory and bestowed rewards. Men who fought at Agincourt found themselves welcomed into the corridors of power, their experience conferring legitimacy and influence. Sir Thomas Erpingham, for example, commanded the archers and later served in government. He is credited with overseeing the deployment of stakes and establishing the archers' formation. Sir Walter Hungerford commanded a retinue of 17 men-at-arms and 55 archers, and is remembered for remarking during the battle that he wished he had more archers, to which Henry replied that he would not wish for a single man more, because the fewer the men, the greater share of honour. This exchange, though apocryphal, mirrors the themes of solidarity and honour central to the Agincourt mythos. Not all Englishmen, however, supported the campaign. Some criticised the war's cost or doubted the legitimacy of Henry's claim. Among the English, there were also those who sympathised with the French or who were wary of the king's consolidation of power. Yet the victory, by silencing critics and uniting factions, made dissent dangerous. The war taxed communities, especially as it continued into the next decade, requiring more levies and resources. The heavy taxation and repeated musters for war contributed to social tensions that would later surface during the Wars of the Roses. As for the French, the defeat at Agincourt did not break their resolve entirely. Within a few years, French forces regrouped and factions continued to vie for control. The role of the Burgundians and the Armagnacs shaped the civil war that paralyzed France until the arrival of Joan of Arc. Agincourt was one battle in a long sequence of events that eventually culminated in French resurgence. Modern French historians sometimes view Agincourt not as a national humiliation, but as a tragic consequence of internal divisions and poor leadership. They emphasize the heroism of French knights who died valiantly and critique the tactical missteps that led to their defeat. Henry's charismatic leadership is often compared with that of his French counterparts. Contemporary chroniclers portray him as pious, just, and determined. He prayed before battle, adopted a modest demeanor, and shared the hardships of his men. He also displayed ruthlessness when necessary, as seen in his order to execute prisoners. Contrarily, some portrayals highlight his severity in dealing with dissent and his suppression of the Lollard heresy. Ultimately, Henry's leadership at Agincourt combined religious fervor with pragmatic strategy. He understood that inspiring his soldiers required more than words. He needed to be present in the front line, to risk his life, and to recognize valor across social strata. His willingness to fight on foot beside his men signaled that he did not consider himself above them in the moment of crisis. The band of brothers ethos has taken on a life of its own in modern times, often invoked to describe tight-knit groups forged in adversity. The phrase has been used to describe soldiers in other wars, sports teams, and workplace teams facing challenges. Its origin in Shakespeare underscores how literature shapes historical memory. The real soldiers at Agincourt formed bonds based on mutual reliance, but their sense of brotherhood had limits. Medieval society remained stratified. After the battle, nobles and common soldiers did not suddenly become equals. Yet for a few hours, on a muddy field in northern France, they fought and bled together, and that shared experience became a powerful symbol of unity. In closing, the complete story of the Battle of Agincourt is one of complexity and nuance. It is a tale of a determined king leading a small, disciplined army against a larger foe, of archers whose strength and skill changed the course of battles, of mud rain and the unforgiving hand of nature, of decisions made under pressure that continue to spark ethical debates, of political machinations that translated battlefield success into diplomatic advantage, and of myths that have amplified and romanticized the events. To understand Agincourt is to appreciate both the verified facts, such as troop numbers and the tactical use of longbows, and the stories that have grown around the battle. By separating speculation from evidence, and by acknowledging the broader context, we gain a richer appreciation of why Agincourt continues to captivate historians, artists, and the public. The legacy of Agincourt is not confined to the year 1415. It reverberates through centuries of literature, national identity, and military thought, reminding us that history is both a record of what was and a canvas upon which societies paint their ideals. The roots of the conflict that culminated in Agincourt can be traced back to earlier decades of the 100 Years' War. The war itself, a series of dynastic disputes interwoven with economic and territorial ambitions, originated when Edward III of England asserted a claim to the French throne through his mother, Isabella. This claim challenged the succession of Philip VI and set English kings on a path of intermittent warfare. Major battles like Crécy in 1346 and Poitiers in 1356 demonstrated the potency of the English longbow, foreshadowing the events at Agincourt. At Crécy, a smaller English force under Edward III withstood repeated French cavalry charges, decimating the French nobility and capturing King John II at Poitiers. These earlier victories had entrenched the belief that longbows could defeat superior numbers. Yet by the late 14th century, the war had devolved into raiding, broken treaties, and shifting alliances. The English reputation for archery remained strong, but France, under Charles V and his capable commanders, notably Bertrand du Guesclin, had successfully reclaimed lost territory through strategic harassment and avoidance of pitched battles. When Henry V renewed the war in 1415, he was consciously evoking the glory days of Crécy and Poitiers, hoping to replicate their success and secure territorial gains that his father, Henry IV, had failed to consolidate. Understanding the longbow requires delving into the craft and training behind it. The classic English longbow was made primarily of yew, a wood prized for its resilience and springiness. Craftsmen selected staves with the heartwood on the belly and the sapwood on the back, creating a natural laminate that could store and release energy efficiently. The bow's length, often equal to the archer's height or slightly longer, allowed for a draw length that generated significant power. Archers practiced from childhood, beginning with smaller bows and progressively working up to war bows. Historical records indicate that archery practice was mandatory. King Edward III's Assize of Arms in 1363 required every able-bodied man to have a bow and arrows, and later statutes threatened penalties for those who neglected practice. Bows were often covered in linen and grease to protect against moisture. Arrows, fletched with goose feathers, came in various types, with bodkin points designed to penetrate mail and plate. A sheaf of arrows typically contained 24 shafts, and archers carried several sheaves into battle. Quivers or arrow bags were slung over the shoulder or attached to belts, allowing rapid access. The archer's ability to maintain a high rate of fire depended not only on strength, but on technique. They drew the string to the ear using back muscles and released smoothly to minimize torque. During battle, archers relied on the rhythm of shooting and retrieving arrows stuck in the ground ahead. The French forces at Agincourt were emblematic of medieval chivalric culture. Knights and nobles viewed battle as both a test of personal valor and a means of social advancement through ransom. Their equipment, though costly and often heavy, represented the highest quality of craftsmanship in Europe. Plate armor had evolved by the early 15th century into a sophisticated system that protected vital areas while allowing mobility. Helmets like the bassinet featured visors that could be raised, and suits were often tailored to fit the individual knight. Over male hauberks, knights wore coats of plates, pauldrons, and greaves. They wielded lances, swords, maces, and axes. Many French nobles brought destriers bred for war, large horses trained to charge in formation. The code of chivalry emphasized face-to-face combat and discouraged reliance on missile troops, which partly explains the reluctance to use crossbowmen effectively. French crossbowmen, drawn from urban militias like those in Paris and Rouen, were fewer in number at Agincourt than at earlier battles. Their crossbows had slower rates of fire than longbows, but could deliver powerful bolts capable of piercing armor. The disparity in missile weapons was compounded by the French command's decision to place crossbowmen behind the vanguard, reducing their influence. At the siege of Harfleur, the dynamics of medieval warfare were on full display. Harfleur sat at the mouth of the Seine, its walls thick and fortified, with towers and a moat that complicated assault. Henry's army deployed siege artillery, bombards, and catapults to batter the walls. Miners dug tunnels beneath the walls, attempting to collapse sections, while engineers built siege towers. The defenders, commanded by the governor Robert de Fontaines and assisted by a contingent of Genoese crossbowmen, resisted valiantly. Disease ravaged both besiegers and defenders. Dysentery, spread through contaminated food and water, caused fever, dehydration, and bloody diarrhea. Men weakened by sickness were easy prey for infection. The prolonged siege demoralized the English, some of whom urged Henry to abandon the investment. Yet the king persisted, aware that withdrawing would signal weakness. When Harfleur surrendered on 22 September, Henry expelled many of its civilian inhabitants, resettling others and installing an English garrison. His decision to continue the campaign despite heavy losses was both courageous and controversial. Some advisors urged a return to England. Henry instead used Harfleur as a symbol of his determination, writing letters to his subjects extolling the capture and calling for prayers and reinforcements. The march across France merits closer examination. After leaving Harfleur, the English army moved in 3 columns, following roads and river paths. They carried minimal baggage, having left heavy equipment at Harfleur, and subsisted on supplies seized or purchased from villages along the route. Chroniclers describe how the army maintained strict formation and discipline. Henry forbade plundering without permission, as he needed to preserve goodwill among locals where possible. Scouts were sent ahead to find safe fords and to watch for French movements. The challenge of crossing the Somme River highlighted the difficulties. French troops under the Marshals Boucicaut and de Louvet garrisoned bridges and fords. For nearly a week, the English probed upstream and downstream, seeking a crossing. Food supplies dwindled and men became exhausted. Finally, near Nice, they found an undefended ford, crossing under the cover of night while skirmishing with French patrols. The march resumed through Picardy with Henry's banners flying high. Even as they neared Calais, the French encirclement tightened. The French army camped near Agincourt blocked the road. Thus, battle became unavoidable. On the eve of combat, the English cut arrow stakes and sharpened them, placed banners, and prepared for mass. They knew the coming day might well be their last, and their preparations mixed fear with determination. Accounts from the French perspective offer additional layers to the story. Chroniclers like the Bourgeois of Paris and Michel Pintoin, the monk of Saint-Denis, lamented the disunity among French lords and criticized the failure to coordinate effectively. They blamed not only tactical errors but moral decline. Excessive pride and rivalry among nobles led to the disaster. The Armagnac-Burgundian civil war had fractured the kingdom, diverting attention and resources away from a united defense. Burgundian forces under John the Fearless did not join the field at Agincourt, remaining neutral or even tacitly supportive of Henry in hopes of weakening the Armagnacs. Pintoin writes that the French men-at-arms were weighed down by their armor and mired in mud, making them easy targets. He portrays them as martyrs of chivalry, falling honorably despite unfavorable conditions. French poets composed laments for the fallen, listing the names of nobles killed and using the defeat to call for repentance and reform. These perspectives remind us that Agincourt was not merely a tale of English glory, but also a French tragedy, with grieving families and disrupted lineages. Henry's commanders deserve individual attention, as their decisions and actions contributed to the outcome. Sir Thomas Erpingham, a veteran of battles in Scotland and the Iberian Peninsula, acted as marshal of the army. His task was to maintain order and coordinate archers. According to some accounts, he gave the signal to begin the arrow volley by throwing his baton into the air and crying, "Now strike." Sir Gilbert de Umfreville, a nobleman from Northumberland, fought in the vanguard. Humphrey, Duke of Gloucester, Henry's younger brother, commanded the right wing and suffered serious wounds in the melee. The Duke of York, a cousin and possible rival to Henry's throne, commanded the left and died in the fighting, demonstrating loyalty to Henry despite past tensions. Sir John Cornwall distinguished himself by capturing a French banner. Among the archers were men like Davy Gam, a Welsh hero, who reportedly saved Henry's life at the cost of his own. Their names, though sometimes obscured by time, illustrate the collective effort that underpinned the king's success. On the French side, the Constable Charles d'Albret held overall command, though his authority was compromised by the presence of powerful princes like the Dukes of Orléans, Bourbon, and Alençon. Marshal Jean II de Boucicaut, an experienced knight and veteran of crusades, commanded a wing. Philip, Count of Nevers, brother of Duke John the Fearless, and Antoine, Duke of Brabant, joined the fray late, arriving on the morning of battle after marching all night. Their desire to redeem themselves from previous defeats motivated their reckless charges. Many French knights refused to heed tactical advice. Boucicaut advocated using archers and crossbowmen to soften the English, but was overruled by hot-headed nobles eager for personal glory. The lack of unified command undermined their efforts. Messages were lost, and orders contradicted each other. Even as the French knights formed three lines, confusion reigned about who would lead and how reserves would be deployed. The constable's attempt to regain control during battle failed as he was killed in the crush. Weather and terrain played a decisive role, not only in the battle itself, but in the days leading to it. October in northern France can be cold and wet. Continuous rains soak the fields, turning ploughed land into a mire. The farmland between the woods of Tramecourt and Agincourt was freshly tilled for winter sowing. The furrows trapped water and sucked at boots. Horses' hooves churned the soil, creating deep mud that clogged greaves and sabatons. Even before the first arrow flew, the French vanguard was struggling to maintain cohesion. The weight of a knight's armor, estimated between 45 and 60 pounds, was manageable on dry ground, but in mud it quickly became a burden. Coupled with helmets that restricted vision, many knights lost orientation. The English, though also wearing armor, were less encumbered because men-at-arms fought on foot and archers wore lighter gear. They planted sharpened stakes at an angle ready to impale horses or trap riders. The stakes were a tactical innovation refined from earlier battles. They could be quickly driven into the ground with mallets and repositioned as needed. After the battle, the fate of prisoners became a topic of controversy. Among those captured were high-profile nobles such as Charles, Duke of Orléans, and Jean, Count of Richemont. Henry treated these valuable prisoners well, knowing their ransom would fund future campaigns. They were housed in comfortable quarters in England and eventually integrated into English society for decades. Charles of Orléans, a poet, spent 25 years in captivity, composing verse that blended melancholy with reflections on chivalry. Ordinary soldiers and lower-ranking knights received harsher treatment. The summary execution of prisoners during the battle, while shocking, was not unprecedented. In earlier medieval wars, including the Scottish Wars and the Crusades, commanders sometimes ordered prisoners killed when they could not be safely guarded. The outcry following Agincourt underscored the tension between chivalric ideals and military necessity. Henry's justification hinged on the immediate threat to his camp. By eliminating prisoners, he reduced the risk of insurrection. Whether this was truly necessary is debated, but it reveals the brutal pragmatism of medieval warfare. The diplomatic repercussions of Agincourt rippled across Europe. The Holy Roman Empire, Spain, and other European powers watched closely. Some states admired Henry's victory and considered alliances, while others feared an overly powerful England. The papacy sought to broker peace, urging Christian kings to unite against the Ottoman Turks rather than fight among themselves. The Burgundians, led by Philip the Good after the assassination of his father, John the Fearless, in 1419, eventually allied with England, culminating in the Treaty of Troyes. This alliance solidified English control of northern France and allowed Henry to conduct campaigns deeper into French territory. The Dauphin's supporters rallied around him, leading to civil war. Agincourt thus indirectly contributed to the fragmentation of the French realm and prolonged the 100 Years' War. It also influenced the development of mercenary companies, as nobles sought to replenish their fortunes through warfare. Narratives of Agincourt have been shaped by writers and artists across centuries. In the 15th century, French chroniclers wrote of tragedy and divine punishment. In the 16th century, English chronicle writers like Holinshed used Agincourt to bolster Tudor legitimacy by drawing parallels between Henry V and Henry VIII. Shakespeare's play, written around 1599, captures Elizabethan concerns about leadership and nationhood. Later painters depicted Henry V standing among fallen French knights, radiant and serene, reinforcing the idea of divine sanction. In the 19th century, Romanticism cast the battle as a clash between nobility and the common man, romanticizing the rural archer. During the bicentennial and quincentenary commemorations, historians revisited the battle with critical eyes, emphasizing socio-economic factors, environmental conditions, and the complexity of medieval warfare. Modern historians like Anne Curry, Juliet Barker, and Christophe Gilliard have authored comprehensive studies that unpack the layers of myth and present nuanced interpretations. Their works draw on muster rolls, financial records, and archaeological evidence to reconstruct the armies and to question earlier assumptions. The global influence of Agincourt extends into popular culture. Films, television series, and books have retold the story, sometimes accurately, sometimes loosely. Kenneth Branagh's 1989 film adaptation of Shakespeare's Henry V portrays the muddy, brutal reality of the battle, counterbalancing the inspirational speeches with visceral imagery. The 2019 film The King presents a fictionalized account, blending historical events with imaginative storytelling. Military historians often cite Agincourt in discussions of asymmetrical warfare where smaller forces employ superior tactics and technology to overcome larger adversaries. The battle is taught in military academies as a case study in leadership, morale, and the exploitation of terrain. Even in business literature, the concept of a band of brothers and the emphasis on disciplined preparation and seizing opportunities have been used as metaphors for corporate strategy. Turning to the internal dynamics of Henry's army, we see a complex hierarchy tempered by mutual reliance. Contracts known as indentures bound nobles and gentry to provide specified numbers of soldiers for fixed periods. These contracts stipulated pay, equipment, and terms of service. They also clarified how ransoms would be divided among the captor, the commander, and the king. The presence of such contracts reflects the professionalization of warfare. Men-at-arms were not mere levies, but trained fighters who invested in quality armor and weapons. Archers, too, might serve in retinues under a knight or directly under the king's banner. The The camaraderie of the army stemmed partly from shared hardships, disease, hunger, and constant marching, and partly from the knowledge that survival depended on each man doing his duty. Henry's emphasis on fairness in dividing plunder and ransoms helped maintain cohesion. He also integrated men from different regions, including the north of England, the Welsh Marches, and the Midlands. This diversity may have tempered regional rivalries and fostered a broader sense of English identity. The economic impact of the campaign on England was significant. War required vast sums for wages, ships, siege equipment, and supplies. Parliament, influenced by the victory, granted generous subsidies. Merchants lent money, expecting to profit from trade with occupied French territories and from ransoms. The capture of wealthy French nobles provided immediate financial return. Towns and monasteries contributed men and supplies. In the long term, however, the war strained royal finances. Henry's successors inherited mounting debts, and the cost of maintaining garrisons in France escalated. Those veterans who returned often found economic hardship, leading some to join private armies or engage in brigandage. The plunder and ransoms did not evenly compensate all soldiers. This uneven distribution contributed to social tensions that would explode in the mid-15th century during the Wars of the Roses. Military historians sometimes compare Agincourt with other famous battles to illustrate broader themes. At Crécy and Poitiers, longbows also played a prominent role, but the circumstances differed. Crécy was fought on a slope, giving the English an elevation advantage. Poitiers involved successful flanking maneuvers and a critical reserve charge led by the Black Prince. Agincourt's distinctiveness lies in the extraordinary disparity between casualties and the dramatic use of terrain. Comparisons with battles outside the 100 Years' War reveal similar patterns. In 1314, Scottish forces under Robert the Bruce defeated English knights at Bannockburn by exploiting boggy ground and using spearmen to repel cavalry. In 1410, Polish-Lithuanian forces annihilated the Teutonic knights at Grunwald-Tannenberg, employing combined arms and tactical deception. In 1476, Swiss pikemen defeated Duke Charles the Bold at Merton and Grandson, demonstrating the power of infantry with long weapons. These examples underscore a shift from mounted knightly dominance to infantry-centric warfare. Agincourt sits at the heart of this transition, showing how disciplined foot soldiers could overturn social expectations. A philosophical lens invites us to consider how narratives of heroism are constructed. The story of Agincourt has been used to champion national virtues, English courage, French pride, Welsh skill, Burgundian ambition. But heroism can be interpreted in many ways. Was Henry heroic because he fought at the front and inspired his men? Or was he ruthless because he executed prisoners? Were the French knights foolish for charging through mud? Or were they brave for adhering to their ideals? The concept of honor drove many decisions. French knights sought to defend their honor by fighting in the van. To avoid the charge would have been shameful. Henry, by contrast, embraced pragmatism and adaptability. He did not allow pride to dictate his tactics. He dismounted his men-at-arms, deployed stakes, and used archery to maximum effect. Thus, heroism emerges not from rigid adherence to tradition, but from the courage to adapt and to endure. Environmental and climatic factors also deserve consideration. The early 15th century was part of the Little Ice Age, a period characterized by cooler temperatures and erratic weather. increased precipitation would have affected crops, roads, and battlefields. Agincourt's muddy conditions were partly a result of this broader climatic trend. Climate impacted logistics, harvests, and the ability of armies to sustain themselves. A poor harvest could reduce available grain for armies and horses, forcing commanders to shorten campaigns. The French knights, reliant on larger and heavier horses, may have suffered more from food shortages. Environmental history thus adds another dimension to our understanding of medieval warfare. When exploring the psychological dimension of the soldiers at Agincourt, we encounter a spectrum of emotions: fear, courage, desperation, and determination. Letters and chronicles reveal the anxiety among English soldiers before the battle. Many believed they would not survive. Some wrote wills. Yet they also drew comfort from the belief that they fought under divine favor. Clergy in the army preached sermons reminding them of Old Testament battles where God delivered victories to the faithful. The celebration of Mass on the morning of 25 October and the chanting of the Veni Creator Spiritus instilled a sense of sacred purpose. For the French, the sense of fighting for their homeland against invaders lent moral weight to their cause. Nobles felt bound to protect their lands and reputations. When defeat came, the psychological shock was profound. Survivor accounts described numbness and disbelief, as well as anger toward commanders. Henry's execution of prisoners added horror to the French experience. On the English side, relief and exultation mixed with exhaustion. They had defied expectations and survived. Many attributed their victory to divine intervention rather than their own prowess. Another aspect often overlooked is the role of non-combatants. Camp followers, including women, merchants, and craftsmen, accompanied the armies. They provided essential services: cooking, washing, repairing equipment, tending to the wounded and burying the dead. Surgeons extracted arrows, treated infections, and amputated limbs. Priests heard confessions and offered last rites. The camp at Maisoncelles included wagons, horses, supplies, and, perhaps, families of soldiers. When French raiders attacked this camp during the battle, they likely targeted not just material wealth, but the vulnerable people present. The existence of a camp underscores that armies were communities on the move, not just fighting units. After the battle, English camp followers helped secure the field, collect arrows, and salvage equipment. We should also consider the interplay of law and warfare. Medieval rules of war were influenced by chivalric codes and by canon law. Ransom practices, truces for the collection of the dead, and protection for clergy were customary. Henry issued orders before the battle forbidding his men from leaving ranks to take booty until the outcome was clear. Such orders had legal standing. Disobedience could result in punishment. After the battle, he enforced discipline regarding prisoners. The French likewise adhered to laws that governed the distribution of spoils. However, the chaotic nature of battle meant these rules were often ignored. The killing of prisoners at Agincourt stands as a notable instance where necessity overrode custom, raising questions about the balance between military expediency and moral conduct. It is instructive to reflect on how the battle might have unfolded differently under altered circumstances. If the French had waited for the English to retreat due to hunger, or if they had harassed them during the march rather than offering battle, the outcome might have favored the French. If the weather had been dry, allowing cavalry to maneuver freely, the French might have overwhelmed the archers. Had the French crossbowmen been deployed effectively to counter the longbowmen, the initial arrow storm could have been blunted. Conversely, if Henry's men had lacked stakes, or if his archers had run out of arrows, the lines might have been breached. Such hypothetical scenarios highlight the contingencies of history. They remind us that victory at Agincourt was not predetermined. It was the product of human choices interacting with environmental and technological factors. Over the centuries, scholars have mined administrative records to reconstruct the composition of Henry's army. Muster rolls list the names, ranks, and pay of soldiers. They reveal that units often mirrored local communities, with men joining under a regional lord or knight. For example, the Duke of York's retinue included men from Yorkshire, while Sir John Cornwall's contingent drew from Cornwall and the southwest. The presence of the Earl of Westmoreland and his men from the north underscores the geographic spread. Financial accounts show how much money was paid to each retinue and how funds were allocated for equipment. These documents also reveal the presence of specialists: engineers, carpenters, wheelwrights, and gunners. Artillery, though not decisive at Agincourt, played a role in the siege of Harfleur and was transported by oxen and horses. The records of arrow production indicate that thousands of arrows were ordered months in advance. Fletchers and arrow makers in London and the Midlands worked overtime to meet demand. Across the Channel, French administrative records also offer insights. The Ordonnance of 1415 called for the mobilization of men-at-arms and archers under royal banners. It detailed pay rates and penalties for desertion. The French crown attempted to standardize equipment and to ensure that towns contributed men proportionate to their populations. Yet implementation was uneven, as local lords controlled recruitment and often prioritized personal retinues over the national levy. The division between the Armagnacs and Burgundians further complicated matters. Some towns withheld troops or funds if they supported the opposing faction. This fragmentation contributed to the French army's logistical difficulties and to the discord at Agincourt. Debates over numbers have persisted since the 15th century. Contemporary English chronicles tended to inflate French numbers to magnify Henry's achievement. The Bruges chronicler Jean de Wavrin claimed there were 60,000 French. Enguerrand de Monstrelet wrote of 36,000. Henry's chaplain implied the French were 6 times as numerous. Modern historians analyzing muster rolls and financial accounts estimate French numbers closer to 12,000 to 20,000. English strength is likewise debated. Some suggest 6,000 to 9,000, while others posit as low as 5,000. The truth likely lies in the middle. Even at 6,000, the English faced a force at least twice their size. Understanding these numbers helps us appreciate the scale of the battle and the magnitude of the English victory while avoiding sensationalism. In the centuries following Agincourt, Europe witnessed the decline of the longbow and the rise of firearms. By the 16th century, arquebuses and muskets, combined with pike formations, dominated battlefields. Firearms required less strength and training than longbows. They could be mastered by conscripts in a short time. Armies grew larger and more professional, yet the memory of Agincourt lingered. English archers continued to be admired, and the longbow remained in use in limited contexts, such as during the early stages of the English Civil War. The cultural legacy of Agincourt thus outlasted the technological relevance of the longbow. This disconnect underscores how historical memory can preserve certain narratives even as practical realities evolve. Agincourt's resonance in modern times extends to discussions about leadership. Henry's ability to lead by example, to communicate clearly, and to instill confidence in his men are studied in leadership courses. His decision to fight alongside his soldiers is cited as a model of servant leadership. At the same time, his severity, seen in the execution order, reminds us that effective leaders often make unpopular decisions. The challenge for modern readers is to discern which aspects of Henry's leadership are timeless and which are products of his era. The battle also invites reflection on the construction of national myths. In England, Agincourt feeds into the narrative of an underdog nation prevailing through ingenuity and courage. This narrative was mobilized during times of national crisis, such as the Napoleonic Wars and the World Wars. In France, Agincourt is often downplayed in school curricula, considered part of a series of medieval conflicts that were overcome by eventual French victories. The selective remembrance of Agincourt illustrates how nations curate their histories to serve contemporary needs. Finally, the human cost of Agincourt, often obscured by nationalistic narratives, deserves acknowledgement. Thousands of men died, leaving behind widows and orphans. Estates were passed to heirs, sometimes minor children. Monasteries held masses for the souls of the dead. The disruption of noble lineages altered local politics. For the families of archers and men-at-arms, the loss of a son or father meant economic hardship. War widows sought relief from the crown or local communities. The trauma of battle left lasting psychological scars on survivors. Though medieval vocabulary lacked the terms to express post-traumatic stress, remembering these personal tragedies adds depth to our understanding of the battle's impact. As we conclude our extended exploration of the Battle of Agincourt, we can appreciate its multifaceted significance. It was a military encounter shaped by strategy, technology, environment, and leadership. It had political ramifications that influenced the course of the 100 Years' War and the destinies of nations. It has been remembered and reinterpreted through literature, art, and popular culture, shaping national identities. It encompasses verified facts and speculative narratives, heroism and tragedy, pragmatism and idealism. By engaging with all these aspects, we honor the complexity of history and resist the temptation to reduce it to simplistic lessons. The story of Agincourt is not just about a single day in 1415. It is about the interplay of human agency and larger forces, the stories we tell about ourselves and the ways in which those stories guide our actions. The training regimen of longbowmen was more than a simple pastime. It was a structured social practice deeply embedded in medieval English communities. Beginning in boyhood, individuals were encouraged to draw lighter bows, gradually increasing the draw weight as their muscles developed. Parish priests sometimes oversaw archery practice on Sundays, ensuring that men gathered after church to shoot at the butt, a mound of earth with a painted target. Records indicate that villages maintained communal butts for practice, and neglecting to practice could result in fines. Archery contests were popular at fairs, where winners received prizes ranging from livestock to silver cups. These competitions not only honed skills, but fostered a sense of regional pride and rivalry. Archers learned to judge distance accurately, adjust for wind and rain, and coordinate volleys with others. They practiced shooting in volleys to mimic battlefield conditions, focusing on rapid knocking and release. The muscle memory developed through these drills allowed archers to maintain a sustained rate of fire without fatigue. The physical effects of long-term archery were evident in the skeletal remains of archers recovered from the Mary Rose. In large bone attachments in the arms and shoulders, asymmetric development and degenerative joint disease. Such anatomical adaptations underscore the intensity of the training and the commitment required to master the bow. Religion permeated every aspect of medieval life, including warfare. The choice of 25th of October, St. Crispin's Day, for the battle held symbolic resonance, even if coincidental. Crispin and Crispinian, twin brothers martyred in the 3rd century, were patron saints of cobblers and leatherworkers. Their feast day celebrated humble crafts and the dignity of manual labor. For English archers, many of whom were artisans, invoking the saints could have been comforting. Henry's army carried relics and crosses, and chaplains accompanied each retinue. They heard confessions, celebrated mass, and offered absolution before battle. Some soldiers wore badges or tokens bearing images of saints or the Virgin Mary. The belief in divine favor was strong. Victories were interpreted as signs of God's approval, while defeats prompted introspection and calls for penance. Henry himself promoted the idea that he was God's instrument, chosen to punish France and claim what he believed rightfully his. After the battle, he ordered thanksgiving services and constructed chapels, including one at Sheen, to commemorate the victory. The fusion of piety and warfare reflects the medieval worldview, where spiritual and temporal realms were intertwined. Beyond the battlefield, the fate of prisoners illuminated the economics of war. Ransom was a lucrative business. Captured nobles negotiated for their freedom through emissaries. Their estates were assessed to determine how much they could pay. Knights and squires provided pledges, hostages, or property to guarantee payment. The value of a prisoner depended on his title, land holdings, and kinship ties. Jean, Duke of Bourbon, paid an enormous ransom to secure his release years later. His family raised taxes on their peasants and sold jewels to meet the demand. Some prisoners, unable to raise sufficient funds, languished in captivity for decades. Others adapted to life in England, marrying local women and acquiring estates. The prolonged captivity of French prisoners created cultural exchanges. French chansons and stories influenced English court culture, while English customs affected the prisoners. The ransoms collected by Henry funded future campaigns, paid debts, and rewarded loyal soldiers. Ransom arrangements were formalized in written contracts, demonstrating the legal sophistication of medieval warfare. The interplay between Henry's war in France and his domestic policies shaped the political landscape of England. At home, Henry dealt with threats from the Lollards, a religious reform movement that challenged the authority of the church and promoted vernacular scripture. In 1414, the Lollard uprising led by Sir John Oldcastle was suppressed. Henry's handling of the rebellion reinforced his alliance with the church and demonstrated his willingness to use force against dissent. His war in France diverted attention from domestic unrest and provided an outlet for restless nobles and soldiers. Parliament, composed of lords and commons, found common cause in supporting the war, seeing it as a means to assert English strength and to secure trade routes. The success at Agincourt validated their investment and encouraged further funding. Yet not all were pleased. The war's demands strained local economies and disrupted lives. Letters and petitions from towns complain about requisitioning, billeting of soldiers, and taxes. Henry balanced these concerns by promising spoils and territories in France, distributing titles and lands to reward service. This patronage system bound the nobility to his cause, but also created expectations that would later prove difficult to fulfill when the war turned against England. French logistical planning for the campaign suffered from disorganization and factionalism. The French crown attempted to muster forces from various regions, but the ongoing civil war between the Armagnacs and Burgundians complicated matters. Armagnac-controlled regions responded to the Dauphin's call, while Burgundian areas hesitated or refused. Supplies, including food, armor, and horses, were slow to arrive at the muster point near Arras. The French army camped for several weeks, consuming local resources and enduring the same rainy weather that plagued the English. Some French chroniclers lament that the army indulged in feasts and tournaments while waiting, failing to maintain readiness. When the moment to march south came, many horses were already weakened. Communication between different contingents was poor, leading to confusion during deployment. The decision to fight at Agincourt stemmed partly from a desire to assert dominance, and partly from fear that Henry might escape. Some nobles argued that shadowing the English and harassing their rear would be more effective, but pride prevailed. The French thus fought on terrain unfavorable to them, ignoring alternative strategies that might have avoided disaster. The role of chaplains and religious ceremonies in both camps deserves further mention. On the morning of the battle, English priests moved through the ranks offering blessings and hearing confessions. Henry permitted his men to kneel and pray before the fight. Some accounts suggest that he promised full absolution for sins committed during battle, encouraging his soldiers to fight without fear of spiritual consequence. He ordered preachers to remind them of the justness of their cause and of the atrocities allegedly committed by the French in earlier wars. On the French side, bishops and abbots accompanied the army, including the Bishop of Sens. They too offered mass and blessings. Some chroniclers describe how the French camp resonated with hymns and the tolling of bells. Both sides believed that God favored them. The presence of clerics on the battlefield underscores the deep integration of religion into military affairs. After the battle, priests from both sides assisted in burying the dead and in performing requiem masses. Following Agincourt, Henry embarked on further campaigns in France. In 1417, he returned with a larger army, capturing towns in Normandy including Caen and Rouen. He adopted a systematic strategy of conquest, building on the momentum of Agincourt. Towns were offered terms, surrender and retain privileges under English rule, or resist and face assault. Henry's reputation for mercy to those who submitted and severity to those who resisted led to numerous capitulations. By 1419, he had taken most of Normandy and turned his attention toward Paris. The Burgundian alliance, solidified by the Treaty of Troyes, allowed Henry to enter the French capital as regent. His marriage to Catherine of Valois in 1420 symbolized the union of England and France under his crown. For a brief period, it seemed that his dream of a dual monarchy might be realized. However, his untimely death in 1422, followed by the minority of Henry VI, destabilized these gains. The ensuing campaigns lacked his leadership, and English fortunes waned as the French rallied under Joan of Arc and adopted more effective military reforms. Joan of Arc's emergence in the 1420s marked a turning point in the Hundred Years' War. Inspired by visions, she galvanized the Dauphin's forces, leading to the lifting of the siege of Orléans. and subsequent victories. French armies adopted more flexible tactics, integrating artillery and professional soldiers. The English, hampered by internal divisions and insufficient resources, struggled to maintain their holdings. The fall of the Duke of Burgundy from alliance after the Treaty of Arras in 1435 deprived them of a crucial partner. By 1453, the war concluded with the loss of all English territories in France except Calais. In retrospect, Agincourt appears as a high point before a long decline. The memory of that battle continued to inspire, but it could not compensate for strategic setbacks and changing geopolitical realities. The eventual expulsion from France would fuel English introspection and contribute to the outbreak of the Wars of the Roses. The Wars of the Roses, a series of civil conflicts between the houses of Lancaster and York, involved many veterans of the French wars. The Duke of York, who died at Agincourt, became a symbol for his descendants. His son Richard, 3rd Duke of York, drew on his father's legacy and challenged the Lancastrian Henry VI. Veterans from Agincourt and later campaigns brought back martial skills and military networks that influenced domestic conflicts. The prestige earned through service abroad translated into political capital at home. Some nobles who had fought alongside Henry VI now found themselves on opposite sides of the civil wars. The experience of archers and men-at-arms also shaped the tactics of the Roses. The longbow continued to be used effectively in battles like Towton in 1461, one of the bloodiest engagements on English soil. The memory of Agincourt thus indirectly influenced English civil strife, illustrating how foreign wars can have long-term domestic repercussions. Internationally, Agincourt influenced perceptions of English and French martial prowess. In Italy and Germany, chroniclers marveled at the English victory. Some Italian city-states considered employing English archers as mercenaries. The Burgundian chronicler Georges Chastelain later compared the English archers to ancient heroes. In the Iberian Peninsula, where longbows were less common, the battle was studied by military thinkers interested in adapting new tactics. Conversely, French writers emphasized the need to reform knightly practices, leading to gradual shifts in training and recruitment. Over time, French commanders placed greater emphasis on combined arms, integrating artillery and infantry. The defeat thus spurred innovation, demonstrating how adversity can drive change. Agincourt's location has become a site of pilgrimage for historians and enthusiasts. The field itself remained farmland, but monuments and memorials now mark where the line stood. The region hosts reenactments and commemorations, with local museums displaying artifacts. Archaeological surveys have uncovered arrowheads, pieces of armor, and traces of the stakes used by archers. Soil analysis confirms the muddy conditions described in chronicles. Researchers have used metal detectors and ground-penetrating radar to map features of the battlefield, helping to validate or challenge traditional accounts. The interplay of archaeology and historiography enriches our understanding and highlights the value of physical evidence in reconstructing past events. The interplay between myth and history is perhaps most evident in the story of the two-fingered salute, purportedly used by English archers to taunt the French. According to a popular legend, the French threatened to cut off the index and middle fingers of captured archers so they could never shoot again. In response, English archers supposedly raised these fingers to show defiance. However, historians have found no contemporary evidence for this gesture. The earliest references appear centuries later and likely arise from misinterpretations or inventions. The persistence of this myth illustrates how easily stories can become embedded in popular culture, regardless of their authenticity. It also underscores the human desire to associate gestures and symbols with historical events. As one examines the Agincourt narrative, the tension between chivalry and emerging military realities becomes clear. Chivalry emphasized honor, individual combat, and noble lineage, while the success of the longbow empowered commoners and emphasized collective action. This tension reflects broader social changes in late medieval Europe, where the rise of towns, commerce, and centralized monarchies challenged the dominance of the knightly class. Agincourt can be viewed as a symbolic moment in which the old order confronted the new. The fact that many nobles perished while common archers survived and were rewarded may have subtly shifted perceptions of worth and merit. In the centuries that followed, Europe gradually moved towards standing armies and professional soldiers, diminishing the role of feudal levies. The rhetorical power of Henry V's supposed speeches continues to resonate because they touch on universal themes: courage in the face of overwhelming odds, equality forged in adversity, and the promise of eternal fame. Even those aware that the words are Shakespeare's creation, not Henry's, find inspiration in the sentiment. The speech has been quoted by leaders, teachers, and coaches to motivate teams and communities. It encapsulates the ideal of shared sacrifice, that those who stand together in dire circumstances will forever be bound by brotherhood. This ideal is not unique to Agincourt. It echoes across many cultures and periods, but the combination of Shakespeare's poetry and the historical event has made the phrase "band of brothers" an enduring motif. Further analysis of longbow arrowheads reveals the sophistication of medieval metallurgy. Arrowheads were produced in standardized shapes: barbed arrows for hunting, bodkin points for armor penetration, and broadheads for tearing wounds. Bodkin points were long and narrow, designed to concentrate force on a small area, thus piercing mail links or sliding between plates. Blacksmiths forged these points from iron or steel, quenching and tempering them to achieve a balance of hardness and toughness. They were then fitted onto wooden shafts and secured with resin or glue. The process was labor-intensive, and production scaled up during times of war. The government contracted with smiths in towns like London, York, and Nottingham to produce thousands of arrowheads. Records show payments for arrow making and transportation. The volume of arrowheads recovered from Agincourt suggests that archers retrieved spent arrows, cleaned them, and reused them when possible, highlighting resourcefulness on the battlefield. Armor technology on the French side was equally advanced. Some knights wore articulated plate armor made by renowned Italian and German armorers. The Milanese style featured smooth surfaces to deflect blows, while the Gothic style from Germany incorporated fluting that added strength. Armorers custom-fitted plates to the wearer, ensuring that joints could move and that weight was evenly distributed. Underneath, knights wore padded gambesons and mail shirts for additional protection. Despite the quality, armor had vulnerabilities at joints and visors, which archers exploited. The arrow storm forced many knights to lower their visors, limiting their vision and breath. Overheating and suffocation were real risks during prolonged exertion. The weight of armor also taxed horses. Historians note that some horses wore armor as well, adding to the burden. The combination of heavy armor, poor conditions, and tactical missteps contributed to the French defeat. The story of Agincourt also touches on the development of military law. Henry promulgated ordinances governing conduct, including prohibitions on looting before victory, rules for ransom, and regulations on camp discipline. Violations could result in corporal punishment or execution. These ordinances reflect the king's attempt to maintain control and preserve morale. They also reveal an early form of codified military law, anticipating later developments in the law of war. Henry's measures to protect clergy, women, and children in enemy territory demonstrate a nuanced approach. While he was ruthless toward combatants, he sought to avoid wholesale slaughter of civilians. Such policies served pragmatic purposes. Winning hearts and minds could facilitate occupation and reduce resistance. The interplay of propaganda and information control was another facet of Henry's strategy. He sent letters to English towns, monasteries, and foreign courts describing the victory in glowing terms. These letters emphasized divine intervention and minimized English losses. They portrayed the French as arrogant and disunited, reinforcing negative stereotypes. By controlling the narrative, Henry aimed to galvanize support at home and to demoralize his enemies. French chronicles attempted to counter this by highlighting valor and framing the defeat as the result of unfortunate circumstances rather than incompetence. Modern historians, aware of these biases, cross-reference multiple sources to reconstruct a balanced account. Education about Agincourt has evolved. In medieval England, stories of the battle were transmitted orally and through handwritten chronicles. As printing spread, pamphlets and books disseminated the tale. In the Victorian era, the battle was taught in schools as part of national history. Students memorized dates and names, internalizing the notion of English exceptionalism. In recent decades, curricula have become more critical, encouraging students to examine sources and to appreciate complexity. Students analyze how the same event can be depicted differently in French and English sources, learning about bias and historiography. Museums and historical societies host interactive exhibits, using digital reconstructions and hands-on displays to engage audiences. Reenactments by historical societies allow people to experience aspects of medieval life, from donning armor to shooting bows. Such educational efforts keep the story alive and adapted to contemporary sensibilities. Music and poetry inspired by Agincourt demonstrate how art reflects and shapes historical memory. The Agincourt Carol, composed shortly after the battle, celebrates the victory with the refrain, Deo gratias Anglia, rede pro victoria. Thanks be to God, England, for the victory. The carol uses a call and response structure, perhaps sung by groups returning from campaign. It praises King Henry and invokes divine assistance. Later poets, including Alfred, Lord Tennyson, referenced Agincourt in their works. Folk songs and ballads kept the story in popular consciousness, blending fact and legend. Music provided a means of communal celebration and a tool for transmitting values. Finally, examining the lives of ordinary soldiers after the battle sheds light on long-term effects. Veterans return to towns and villages carrying stories of heroism and horror. Some use their earnings and prestige to marry, buy land, or start businesses. Others struggled with injuries and poverty. The government sometimes granted pensions to wounded soldiers, but resources were limited. Veterans formed networks that could mobilize for future conflicts or local feuds. Their experiences abroad altered their worldview. They had seen different lands, cultures, and warfare styles. This exposure could lead to greater cosmopolitanism, but also to disillusionment. On a psychological level, the trauma of warfare may have manifested in nightmares, withdrawal, or aggression. Medieval society lacked the framework to diagnose or treat such conditions. Communities often interpreted erratic behavior as spiritual affliction or moral failing, rather than psychological trauma. Recognizing these human experiences reminds us that beyond kings and nobles, history is made up of countless individuals whose lives were forever changed by events like Agincourt.